Trump believed he had Canada in an inescapable corner. His entire pressure campaign against Ottawa was constructed on one piece of devastating arithmetic. Canada directs 97% of its oil exports to a single customer. One buyer. One direction. No exit built into the architecture. When you are the only purchaser at the table, you dictate every term. That was the Trump leverage theory, and for months it held. Canada was reactive, defensive, perpetually trying to protect market access it could not afford to surrender. Then, on May 15th in Calgary, Mark Carney signed an agreement that begins dismantling that leverage one pipeline corridor at a time. And in the 4 days between that signing and this broadcast, the story has moved considerably further than most observers have yet recognized. Here is precisely where things stand. And here is why the most powerful instrument in Trump's strategic toolkit against Canada is beginning to show visible cracks. The agreement Carney signed with Alberta Premier Danielle creates a formal, legally grounded, and regulatorily structured framework for a new oil pipeline running from Alberta to Canada's Pacific coast, targeting capacity exceeding 1 million barrels per day, aimed directly at buyers in Japan, South Korea, China, and India. The timeline is aggressive and entirely deliberate. Alberta submits its formal application to the Federal Major Projects Office by July 1st. The federal government designates it a project of national interest by October 1st. Construction approval is targeted for September 1st, 2027. The pipeline is expected to enter service between 2033 and 2034. Every single one of those milestones is calibrated around one strategic reality: the USMCA trade review with the United States. Carney needs these facts on the ground, embedded in Canadian regulatory infrastructure, before Trump's negotiators arrive at the table carrying their maximum demands. The pipeline is not simply infrastructure, it is a negotiating position, and it is being constructed on a schedule that tracks Washington's calendar rather than Alberta's. To understand why Trump is genuinely unsettled by this, and the evidence that he is unsettled is visible in plain sight if you know where to look, you need to examine what he did 2 weeks before Calgary. On April 30th, Trump was in the Oval Office signing the Bridger Pipeline Expansion Authorization, sometimes referred to as Keystone Light, approving up to 550,000 barrels per day of Canadian crude to flow southward from the Montana border through Wyoming into American refineries. He signed it with enthusiasm, publicly celebrating that his administration approved pipelines. He was correct. He approved a pipeline. But what he approved was a pipeline that moves Canadian oil south, deeper into the American refining system, reinforcing precisely the dependency that gives his trade team its leverage over Ottawa. The timing of that signing was not accidental. Trump authorized a southward pipeline 2 weeks before Carney was preparing to sign a westward one. American industry analysts were explicit about the strategic intent. Fortune magazine reported that industry figures publicly argued the newly permitted American pipeline projects should eliminate any commercial rationale for a West Coast alternative, with one analyst stating he was skeptical of a Western route and doubted Canada wanted the financial burden of building additional capacity. Read that framing carefully. American energy insiders were publicly arguing in American financial press that Trump's southward pipeline approval rendered Carney's westward pipeline economically unnecessary. That is not infrastructure commentary. That is strategic messaging aimed directly at Canadian oil producers, telling them to commit their volumes south, lock into the American system, and stop waiting for an Asian alternative. Because if Canadian producers fill their capacity commitments southward, through Bridger, through Enbridge's mainline expansion, adding 150,000 barrels per day of southward capacity by 2027, through the Dakota Access Pipeline Northern Extension currently under active discussion, the West Coast Pipeline has no committed shippers and no viable financing. Washington was racing to fill the commercial pipeline before the political one could reach the construction stage. Bloomberg captured the dynamic concisely. Ottawa wants to weaken its dependence on the US, but Washington has other ideas. The analysis was direct. US-Canada relations have become severely strained during Trump's second term, but on the question of oil, the two countries appear to be growing more economically interdependent than ever, much to the frustration of the Canadian government. Much to the frustration. That phrase communicates everything. The interdependence being built through Trump's pipeline authorizations is not the organic product of market forces. It is deliberate strategic maneuvering. Every new barrel committed to the American refining system is a barrel that will not flow to Asia. And every barrel that does not reach Asia preserves Trump's leverage heading into the most consequential trade negotiations Canada has faced in a generation. Carney signed the Calgary Agreement anyway. And in the days since, he has moved faster than even the Calgary ceremony suggested. On May 20th, just 5 days after Calgary, Carney flew to Vancouver and entered the most politically sensitive meeting of the entire pipeline effort. He sat down with BC Premier David Eby, the leader whose cooperation the pipeline cannot proceed without, and whose province the oil must cross to reach the ocean. Eby had been publicly critical, openly skeptical, and conspicuously absent from the Calgary signing ceremony. He had told reporters there was still no established route, no committed project proponent, and no genuine progress since the concept was first announced 2 years prior. His resistance represented the most concrete and immediate obstacle between the Calgary Agreement and an actual pipeline in the ground. Speaking to the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade before his closed-door meeting with Eby, Carney declared that the world was experiencing an energy crisis and that Canada must supply the natural resources it requires. He linked the pipeline explicitly to Canadian independence from the American trade confrontation, describing the project and related natural resource developments as instruments designed to make Canada more economically self-sufficient as the trade war dragged on. That is a prime minister standing in British Columbia and using the Trump trade war as the primary argument for why British Columbia should allow Alberta's oil to cross its territory to reach the Pacific. He was not making an environmental argument, he was making a sovereignty argument. He was telling Eby that the choice between this pipeline and no pipeline is also the choice between a Canada capable of standing independently and a Canada structurally dependent on American goodwill. That is how directly the Trump dynamic is now shaping even the internal federal-provincial politics of this project. Carney established 3 conditions he described as non-negotiable during his Vancouver address. The Pathways Carbon Capture project must be completed. The pipeline must deliver substantial and demonstrable financial benefit to British Columbians, and it must fully honor Canada's constitutional obligation to consult with Indigenous peoples under Section 35. And then he did something that surprised the political commentators covering the event. He threatened to redirect federal attention and investment toward other parts of the country if BC continued to delay engagement. He told the Board of Trade directly that if things stalled in British Columbia, the federal government would be directing its time and capital elsewhere because the national agenda required moving forward at scale. That is not a gentle federal suggestion. That is leverage applied in public. Carney was communicating to Eby that federal infrastructure investment, federal project prioritization, and federal regulatory fast-tracking would follow demonstrated willingness to cooperate on the national energy agenda. British Columbia has its own priorities: LNG project support, clean energy grid expansion, federal economic partnership on multiple fronts. Carney tied those BC interests explicitly to BC's willingness to engage substantively on the Alberta pipeline corridor. It was a precise application of federal-provincial pressure, delivered publicly in front of the BC business community so that Eby could not quietly set it aside in private conversations. And it produced movement. Eby agreed to enter formal negotiations regarding BC's economic priorities and Ottawa's role in national development investment. He maintained his personal opposition to lifting the North Coast tanker ban. But the word negotiations is doing enormous structural work in that sentence. A BC Premier who was previously declining substantive engagement on the pipeline question is now at a formal negotiating table. That is real movement, and it materialized within a single week of Calgary. This matters enormously for the Trump strategic calculation because one of the primary bets Washington was making, one of the structural foundations of American confidence that the West Coast pipeline would never reach completion, was that British Columbia would never genuinely cooperate. Provincial opposition was supposed to function as the ceiling that terminated the project before it could threaten American leverage over Canadian energy exports. That ceiling has now developed visible fractures. ATB Financial's chief economist noted that the added regulatory clarity around pipeline construction timelines sends a materially positive signal to the market and should generate real pressure to advance the project toward execution. He calculated that the pathway's carbon capture development and additional pipeline corridor capacity together could contribute an average of 1.1% to Canada's real GDP and 5.1% to Alberta's real GDP between 2027 and 2035. Those are not marginal improvements. They represent a fundamental reorientation of the Canadian economy's growth trajectory, and they provide every political actor, including Eby, with a concrete financial argument for finding a workable path forward. Now, let us examine what the pipeline actually does to Trump's trade confrontation leverage in practical terms, because this is the most analytically significant question, and it is receiving almost no serious attention in mainstream coverage. Trump's ability to apply meaningful pressure on Canada through the USMCA review rests on Canadian vulnerability across multiple commercial sectors: dairy, automotive, steel, aluminum, digital regulation. But the foundational vulnerability beneath all of those sector-specific disputes is energy. As long as Canada's primary export commodity, oil worth over $100 billion annually, has access to only one buyer, Ottawa negotiates with a structural gun pointed at its own economic foundation, not a metaphorical weapon, a literal financial one. Any credible threat of escalating the trade confrontation into the energy sector exposes Canada to a potentially catastrophic market access disruption. American negotiators understand this. Canadian negotiators understand this. It shapes the psychological architecture of every meeting between the two sides. Canada's Energy Minister Tim Hodgson stated plainly that even following Trump's approval of the Southward Bridger pipeline, Canada remains committed to diversifying its trading partnerships. Adam Waterous, executive chairman of Strathcona Resources, Canada's fifth-largest oil producer, was even more direct, arguing that oil gives Canada economic hard power in its dealings with the Trump administration, and that as a result, Canada should be positioned to negotiate the most favorable possible trade terms with both the United States and the broader global market. Economic hard power. That phrase is the complete strategic thesis of the Carney pipeline compressed into 4 words. A country with a single buyer possesses no economic hard power in any energy negotiation. A country with 2 buyers, or the credible, commercially real prospect of 2 buyers, possesses the capacity to say no. That capacity to decline is what transforms CUSMA negotiations from a defensive holding action into a genuine exchange between parties operating from comparable positions of structural strength. The moment the Carney pipeline receives federal national interest designation in October, assuming the timeline holds as structured, the commercial and legal reality of a competing Asian export route becomes formally embedded in Canadian infrastructure planning documents. At that point, producers begin making volume allocation decisions. Long-term Asian supply contracts begin entering serious commercial discussion. The final investment decision window for the West Coast pipeline spans 2026 to 2027, and any Asian energy buyer that secures a long-term supply agreement before those decisions close is purchasing energy security insurance against future Middle Eastern supply disruption at a pricing level that will appear extraordinarily favorable in retrospect. Japanese and South Korean energy ministries understand this. They are monitoring the Canadian regulatory approval process with close attention. The competitive infrastructure contest between the Trump-authorized southward route and the Carney-supported westward one is therefore simultaneously a contest for shipper volume commitments. Whether Canadian oil producers will commit substantial volumes to the southward Bridger pipeline is becoming commercially uncertain as producers evaluate how much crude they are prepared to route south, particularly as commercial momentum builds around the Pacific alternative. Every producer holding back from a southward commitment is a producer maintaining optionality for Asian market access, and every producer maintaining that optionality is simultaneously weakening the commercial foundation for Bridger while strengthening the financial case for the Pacific corridor. This producer hesitation is not a future dynamic. It is occurring right now as executive teams review capital allocation plans and long-term infrastructure commitments. Now let us examine the obstacles with the same analytical honesty, because understanding where the blocking strategy retains genuine potential is as important as understanding where it is failing. The indigenous consultation requirement is the most consequential challenge, and it is the one through which external financial opposition can generate the most structural delay without leaving a visible fingerprint on the process. Canada's Constitution, specifically Section 35, imposes a Crown obligation to consult meaningfully with Indigenous peoples before any major infrastructure project receives approval. Courts have interpreted this duty expansively across decades of jurisprudence, and First Nations legal teams have used it to delay or terminate every major Canadian pipeline project of the past 20 years. Northern Gateway was defeated partly through Section 35 litigation. Trans Mountain faced years of court-ordered delay. Coastal GasLink triggered sustained national blockades and ongoing Wet'suwet'en opposition that remains incompletely resolved. The Assembly of First Nations has called for the complete withdrawal of the Canada-Alberta Pipeline Agreement. Coastal First Nations groups have been explicit that their opposition is not to inadequate consultation. It is to the project itself, regardless of process quality or economic benefit structure. These are positions that cannot be resolved by offering co-ownership stakes, however financially generous those stakes might be. Some coastal nations have stated unambiguously that no level of economic participation justifies the environmental risk they perceive to their marine territories. That position is constitutionally protected and represents the terrain where external financial resources can most effectively amplify opposition through legal challenges, investor pressure on financial institutions considering project financing, and political networks with vastly greater funding capacity than any previous Canadian pipeline fight has encountered. Washington does not need to defeat the project outright. It simply needs to delay approval past the USMCA review window, so the threat of a West Coast alternative never materializes during the negotiation that matters most. That is the sophisticated blocking strategy in its most operationally effective form. Not a public American diplomatic objection, but quiet financial support flowing through the legal machinery that has successfully terminated Canadian pipelines before. But here is what both Carney's critics and Trump's strategic planners are underestimating. The political architecture of this particular agreement is fundamentally different from every previous Canadian pipeline attempt. And the difference is not only the co-ownership model or the carbon pricing accommodation. The difference is the existential urgency generated by Trump himself. Every time Trump escalates the trade confrontation, every time he invokes annexation language, every time he treats the relationship as one of American dominance requiring Canadian subordination, he provides Carney with another concrete argument for British Columbia, for Indigenous communities weighing co-ownership terms, for institutional investors evaluating whether not having Pacific export capacity represents an unacceptable long-term risk. Trump is not merely the reason this pipeline is being built, he is its most effective advocate. Every act of American economic aggression strengthens the case that a second buyer for Canadian crude is not a strategic luxury. It is a national security imperative. The Calgary Agreement formally commits the federal government to pursuing construction approval by September 2027, transforming the project from a political aspiration into an institutional obligation that is structurally harder for any future government or any American pressure campaign to simply erase from the planning landscape. The economic scale of success is transformative in character. The project is projected to generate $16.5 billion in GDP contribution, $12.2 billion in labor income, and up to 43,000 jobs annually across its operational life. Alberta's net crude oil export receipts climbed from 6 billion Canadian dollars in 2000 to 130 billion Canadian dollars in 2024. The Pacific Pipeline directly extends that growth trajectory by accessing markets in Japan, South Korea, China, and India, where demand for hydrocarbon energy is projected to remain structurally strong for decades. The value of Alberta's oil exports to Asia moved from zero before Trans Mountain's Pacific Terminal became operational to over $804 million by October 2025. Within just over a year of Pacific market access becoming commercially available, the buyers exist, the demand is real and growing, the constraint is infrastructure capacity, and the regulatory framework signed in Calgary represents the most serious Canadian effort in history to resolve that bottleneck. ATB Economics projects oil and gas export growth of approximately 2% in both this year and 2027, with the binding constraint being pipeline capacity rather than market demand. Japan and South Korea are prepared to pay a premium for barrels sourced from politically stable, democratically governed suppliers, particularly when Middle Eastern supply routes remain exposed to geopolitical disruption. Canadian heavy crude shipped from the Pacific coast represents exactly the supply security alternative these economies have been seeking. Abundant reserves, stable democratic governance, and shipping routes that do not transit the geopolitically volatile choke points constraining Gulf supply. The strategic alignment between what Canada possesses and what Asian energy markets require is not theoretical. It is being validated in real commercial time through the growing frequency and depth of conversations between Canadian energy officials and Asian sovereign energy buyers. Now let us step back to the full geopolitical frame, because what is unfolding in North America right now is historically distinctive in a manner that deserves explicit acknowledgement. A mid-sized power confronted with sustained economic aggression from the world's largest economy is responding neither by capitulating to the pressure nor by retaliating symmetrically, both of which would ultimately represent losing strategies, but by methodically reconstructing the foundational dependency that made the aggression strategically viable in the first place. That constitutes a third strategic option that is rarely executed successfully because it demands time, sustained political patience, domestic coalition construction across hostile provincial divisions, and the willingness to absorb near-term political cost in exchange for long-term structural repositioning. Carney is executing that third option against a clock set by Trump's own USMCA review timeline. The internal Canadian political dynamics of this execution reveal something important. Carney is a Liberal Prime Minister who has substantially adopted the energy policy framework of the Alberta Conservatives. He abandoned the federal emissions cap on the oil sector. He exempted Alberta from clean electricity regulations. He stood in Calgary and embraced pipeline expansion using the same political vocabulary that Danielle Smith had been deploying for years while attacking the federal government. That reversal is only possible because Trump made the cost of the previous liberal energy model, the Trudeau-era approach of managed American dependency, visibly and personally unacceptable to a Canadian electorate now watching their country's trading relationship be actively weaponized. Carney told the Vancouver business audience that when Canada masters its energy capacity, it masters its economic destiny. That is not the measured language of a technocratic central banker managing a policy portfolio. It is the language of a leader who has concluded that energy sovereignty is the defining national project of his government and who is willing to use Trump's aggression simultaneously as the justification for that project and as the accelerant driving its political feasibility. The Trump administration's public response to all of this has been notably and revealingly absent. There has been no official White House statement about the Calgary Agreement, no public criticism of a deal explicitly designed to route Canadian energy away from American refineries and toward Asian buyers, no diplomatic messaging from the State Department. The silence is more analytically informative than any statement would have been. Washington understands what Calgary represents. It signed the Bridger Pipeline 2 weeks earlier in a direct attempt to preempt exactly this kind of agreement. It did not succeed in preempting it. And now the official response is silence, because any public acknowledgement of alarm would itself constitute an admission that the West Coast Pipeline poses a genuine threat to American trade leverage, which would only strengthen Carney's domestic political case for accelerating the project. Trump approved a pipeline pointing south. Carney is building one pointing west. Both leaders signed pipeline agreements within the same 2-week window. One of those pipelines serves the strategic interests of the country that authorized it. The other, in one of the more profound strategic ironies of the decade, serves the interests of the country that was supposed to remain structurally dependent and without alternatives. For Trump, the Pacific Pipeline represents a position of genuine strategic discomfort. He cannot officially oppose it without publicly admitting it threatens his leverage, which would only strengthen Carney's political position. He cannot allow it to proceed without watching his foundational USMCA advantage erode in real time. And he cannot intervene to stop it without overstepping into direct interference in the domestic infrastructure decisions of a sovereign nation. That is not theatrical panic. It is the quieter and more consequential discomfort of a strategist watching his core assumption that Canada has nowhere else to go, being disproved one regulatory milestone at a time. Carney has not yet won this. The July 1st submission deadline is weeks away. The October national interest designation is months away. The BC negotiations are open but unresolved. The indigenous consultation process has not yet begun in earnest and will represent the longest and most contested phase of the entire approval sequence. The private sector proponent question, which company or consortium will actually commit tens of billions of dollars to build the physical infrastructure, remains publicly unanswered. CIBC analysts are correct that September 2027 is the best-case construction start scenario, with multiple regulatory and commercial gates still to clear. The obstacles are genuine, the opponents are capable and well-resourced, and the financial tools available to slow the project through legal challenge are substantial and will be deployed. But the political conditions that made a West Coast oil pipeline effectively impossible in Canada no longer exist. The Liberal-Conservative provincial coalition behind this agreement is without precedent in Canadian political history. The federal government's formal commitment to national interest designation is institutional and binding in ways that political aspirations are not. The economic urgency is real and growing, and the strategic logic that a 97% dependency on a trading partner actively weaponizing that dependency represents an unacceptable national vulnerability has been permanently transformed from a think tank policy argument into a kitchen table political reality for every Canadian who watched their country absorb a 25% tariff on goods that had flowed freely across the border for decades. Trump constructed his trade confrontation on Canada's dependency. Carney is building the infrastructure that ends it. The pipeline pointing west is still being constructed, legally, politically, and commercially. But it is more real today than it was a week ago, more real than it was a month ago. and incomparably more real than it was before. Trump gave Carney the political permission to pursue it by making the cost of the alternative, permanent structural subordination to American commercial preferences, transparently and publicly unacceptable to the Canadian electorate. That is the Trump factor rendered in full. He created the precise threat he was attempting to exploit, and the pipeline he approved in the Oval Office while celebrating his infrastructure record will be remembered as the Southward One, the instrument designed to lock Canada into permanent energy dependence, signed 2 weeks before Canada decided it was finished being locked in. Like, subscribe, and share. This channel delivers real analytical value.